Hello, guys, and welcome back, and happy Halloween, because Halloween's pretty much going to be when we're going to be released, I think. October 30th, that's basically Halloween.
Yeah, happy Halloween. Last weekend, I don't know, I wouldn't really call it a crazy weekend, to be honest. We didn't have as many upsets as we would have thought, and because of that, Indiana didn't move at all for our sake. But, if you just want to start with them, just to, get that out of the way, then we can just move on to, other conferences if you're cool with that.
Yeah, I think Indiana's a great place to start. When is Indiana not a great place to start? Especially after last weekend. We had College Game Day come to town. Oh, my goodness. It was crazy. It was so loud. I can't even believe, it's so crazy to me, especially just because, I've been here when there's been no one watching the football games or anything. When there really wasn't an active fan base, we were kind of like a sleeping giant, in a sense. And now all of a sudden, we find this new success. We're 8-0 now, and now we're just up and at 'em. Everyone's going to the games. When I went to the Washington game yesterday, it was the most packed I'd ever seen the stadium. With myself being inside of it, it was just electric. And the score for the IU game, it's a little deceiving. 31-17, it's not as dominant as we normally are, but we also have to consider that we didn't have our starting quarterback in the game, and that is going to change the offense one way or another, and it's going to take time to adjust. But I think Rourke should be better for Michigan State, but I'm wondering whether or not we should even play him for Michigan State.
I think I'll answer after, but yeah, no, this was a crazy atmosphere. Just from the very beginning, we'll start at 2 p.m. on a Friday, right? You have people already lining up outside Memorial Stadium, getting ready for College Game Day. You have fans bringing out chairs, sitting on the sidewalk, just staying overnight. IU has become such a dedicated football fan school, and this is the first time we've had College Game Day come down to Bloomington. So it was crazy to see just how everything kind of played out, and how many people there were at College Game Day. And obviously we were both there. We both got to see certain parts of it, which were really cool. I saw the field goal, you saw the show. That was insane. But no, yeah, and going back to your point about just IU and how they play this game, 31-17, right? Taven Jackson, in my opinion, I don't think he really had the best game. I think it definitely could have been a little cleaner in terms of the way he played, but obviously it's his first start for IU this year, so you kind of have to give him some flexibility in how he plays. But I think I honestly would rather play Curtis Rourke, just because I don't want IU to go on upset watch at all. And if he is still at that point where he's questionable heading into Saturday, and on Friday he's it's going to be a game time decision, throw Taven Jackson in. But if you're ready and you want to have him suit up in case the game gets close at some point, Taven Jackson starts kind of sliding off the grid a little bit, then you could throw him in whenever they need him. But yeah, I would rather have Rourke start if he's ready to go. But if not, Taven Jackson, I think that should be sufficient enough to get a win over Washington or Michigan State.
Yeah, I think for the Michigan State game, they probably, depending on how quickly we start, we'll probably have Curtis Rourke start the first half, maybe see how he's doing. And then if we're up by 4 scores, if it's I don't know, 28-7 or something like that, then we'll probably put Taven in, just because, it's a safe enough distance. And Taven kind of proved himself. He started to find his rhythm during the Washington game. There's a couple turnovers that were a little costly. They weren't necessarily his fault. There's one of the interceptions bounced off a helmet, which you can't really put that on him entirely, but and also like you said, it was his first actual start this year with this team, and they're all used to playing with Rourke. They have played with Taven a few times this year when Rourke's been taken out, just because we've been dominating or Rourke being injured, but it's it's still going to take time for them to get used to him. But on that same note, if they put Rourke in at the beginning and they're just now getting used to Taven, that might throw off their rhythm a little, again, to where they have to readjust. But I mean, either way, I think IU going into Michigan State, we should win that game. I mean, I know some people are saying it's a trap game. I think it might be a trap game too, just a little bit, but I think we should still come out on top.
Yeah, I think so too. And I mean, we saw obviously you said we saw flashes with Taven, and not even just for this year, but we're looking at our future quarterback for next year, because obviously Curtis Rourke, he's a sixth-year senior, and he's going to leave after this year. But yeah, no, I think next week we should be fine with Taven. I mean, Washington was by far probably our toughest test just because of having our backup quarterback in. But obviously, I think Nebraska, that was supposed to be a harder game, but obviously the results were very different. But yeah, I want to give credit to Taven just for stepping in, but I also want to give credit to the defense, because the defense played outstanding, especially D'Angelo Pons. That man balled out on Saturday, and he had one pick six, then he had a TFL, and then he had another interception that was bobbled midair, and he was able to bring it down as he was coming down. That was crazy, and just it was nuts how that kind of momentum just transpired over the offense, and then kind of just changed the whole crowd atmosphere, because I feel like the fans really got into it after there was a big play, and without those big plays, I don't think IU fans would have been as into the game as you would expect them to be. I mean, looking at the box score right now, Indiana, they had a touchdown every quarter, which they're very consistent. I mean, one of those touchdowns in the first quarter came because of a D'Angelo Pons pick six. So that kind of was the jump start for IU. And I think because of that, the momentum kind of just carried on. Tatum was able to bring the offense back to life, and that's when IU started to go on.
I think the only point really where I thought the momentum was kind of shifting towards Washington was at the beginning of the second half, when on the first play we had that interception and then Washington scored a couple plays later. Right after, Washington also got us to stop and have to settle for a field goal at the end of the first half. At that point, it kind of felt like the momentum was shifting towards Washington, but we bounced back really quickly, and then we just kept dominating after that, which I thought was really good on our part. It showed just adversity. And I think, like you said, Washington, even though we had our backup quarterback in, I still think Washington would have been a bigger test than Nebraska, because I feel like they're better and experienced all around team, whereas Nebraska is they have a more experienced defense and a little bit more of a rookie offense kind of. I mean, Nebraska, their defense was top 10 in stopping the rush. They would allow less than 100 yards per game before they played us, and then we dropped more than 200 rushing yards on them. But Washington, they're a more better built all around team. They have a pretty good quarterback, decent O-line, decent weapons, solid defense. They're not. And they have a decent coach. Jed Fish, he coached Arizona, and he helps them get to the top 25. He kind of did what Signetti did a little bit. He brought them back into the football sphere. He made Arizona kind of relevant again. Then he leaves, and Arizona's kind of not relevant anymore. But I mean, yeah, Washington, they were definitely our biggest test. I mean, in comparison to Nebraska, even though we were using our backup quarterback, I don't think that was the sole reason as to Washington being the bigger test.
Yeah, and just sticking with that point too, I think Washington and Nebraska, I think they had very similar mindsets with how they were going to attack IU. Maybe it would have been a little different for Washington just because of how Curtis Rourke was hurt, so they had to throw Taven in. But over the past two games, Will Rogers and Dylan Raiola against IU, they had 0 touchdowns and 5 INTs. Raiola had 3, Rogers just had 2 on Saturday. So Indiana's passing defense has just been outstanding, and they've come up big when they've needed to. And now, I'm not really I don't want to shift it over just yet, but just IU beat Nebraska 56-7, right? And we saw Ohio State just beat Nebraska by 4, 21-17. So we can get into that. But yeah, I think this game, it was a battle of like the running backs, really. Like Jonah Coleman, he had 19 for 104. So obviously he was kind of getting the feeding hand, while Ellison he had 29 carries, which is a crazy amount for an IU running back for I don't even know how long, but he had 29 carries for 123 and a touchdown. Like IU had 52 rushing attempts and 19 passing attempts. So I think as the game kind of went on, I think Signetti just tried to get the ground game going. And obviously that O-line for IU, they've just been outstanding so far this year. And I think being able to use these like 3 different running backs and then include Taven, who is just lightning quick as at the quarterback position, the RPOs, the read options, like everything just kind of carries itself over, and it kind of just makes like the wiggle room that IU needs in order to get these big plays. And obviously we saw how just explosive the run game was at certain times. And just even for Washington too, like Jonah Coleman, he had 19 carries for 104. Like he played outstanding too. He was averaging 5.5 a carry. So it's just the run game was the big factor here. And I think obviously like you talk about like the O-line and D-line, how they've played such a big factor for both these teams so far this year. And I think IU, that really helped them pull through and win by 14.
Yeah, I agree. Our offensive line, I mean, we definitely saw this with the Nebraska game too. Like the way they're able to create these big gaps for our running backs to just go through and make these huge runs, like they do a really good job of that. Like it's phenomenal how they're able to do that. I mean, it's like that's one of the hardest jobs I think that you have to do, because I mean you're going up against like, I mean you're built really big, like 250 plus pounds of muscle, and you're probably like almost 7 foot tall. The other guys are built the same way. Like it's basically like 2 giant trucks just crashing right into each other, and you have to somehow control it to where it creates a gap for the smaller running back to run through. I mean, not to say that like the running backs are like not built or anything, but like they're not built like linemen, you know? So, I mean, they've got to figure out how to fit through those gaps, whether those gaps are big or whether they're small or whatever, or they have to be quick enough to run around the outside. I mean, it's like our O-line, like they have a really tough job, and that job is super important for our run game to be successful.
Yeah, and I'll tell you too, just like a quick stat. I don't know if you even knew this, but Indiana, they had 9 different receivers catch the ball. There was not one receiver who caught more than 2 passes for IU, which is crazy. Washington, they had 7 receivers. 4 of them caught more than 2 passes. So Jackson did a nice job of spreading the ball around. And like, obviously he had 11 completed passes to 9 different receivers. So Signetti and the offense have just made it work to the point where they can really get the ball in anyone's hands that they really want to. Like, this was a great example of that. And I think when you kind of carry that over to bigger games like the Michigan game, which I don't even know if that'll be a big game anymore, but the Michigan game, then you have the Ohio State game, like it's gonna be really interesting to see during the Ohio State game, especially just how Rourke can kind of spread that ball around to these receivers, because obviously Jackson, they kind of had to change the offense into his type of style. But I think if Rourke is able to spread the ball around like Jackson did, it's going to be hard for some of these defenses in the future to kind of like keep up and get coverage on all these different guys that keep subbing in and out in every play. So I think oh my God, I'm sorry. I think Jackson did a really good job of like spreading the ball around and giving people an opportunity and just having that run game at his disposal whenever they need an audible or whenever they're at a short going distance.
Yeah, I mean, kind of going off of that too. Like, I mean, I might pivot a little bit,
Yeah.
but with the Texas A&M and LSU game, I mean, we saw like LSU was dominating the first half of that game, and then Texas A&M, they make a switch with their quarterback, and I think their first quarterback, like he's more of a system guy, kind of like Rourke, who he's more in the system, making good decisions, like throwing the ball to the right people, like calling the run play for the right time and everything. The quarterback they put in, though, kind of like Taven, he's a little more athletic, can run the ball, and that's what essentially cost LSU the game because they could not stop that quarterback run. And I think that is something that really works for IU because we have, like, it really just shows how versatile our offense is and how quickly we can switch styles from more of a pass forward offense to a rush forward offense. And we have like Taven, he's really good at running. I mean, he scored a rushing touchdown against Washington. But like we also have a lot of other running backs. Like we could put it's essentially almost like the Ravens. Like the Ravens have Lamar Jackson and they have Derrick Henry. And it's like, how do you stop that rushing offense? Like that's kind of like IU's rushing offense. I mean, it's really difficult to stop because we have so many people that can run well with the ball and make big plays.
Yeah, and like you make the NFL comparison about like the Ravens. I want to make another NFL comparison of both of our quarterbacks, Rourke and Taven. It's going to be interesting. I want to say the Saints. You know, Derek Carr, that's kind of like a Curtis Rourke type style play. I mean, obviously, Rourke, I think he has better pocket presence and he's able to like kind of get out of like these different pressures. But Taven's kind of like Taysom Hill a little bit. Like I feel like you can kind of throw him in anywhere and he can just like perform at his best. Like he's so athletic and the amount of like and he had a couple QB designed runs during the game too. And obviously, like you said, he had that rushing touchdown. So that was great by him. But I think overall they both have their certain traits. And I think Rourke has been better with the pocket presence and able to stay in there until it kind of just breaks down and he has to like evade a stack. And how many times have you seen him so far this year kind of like duck under a defender and get away? Like I've seen it at least twice every week. Like he's so great at that and he's able to extend plays, make things happen, get his receivers open. While Taven, he's more of that like if they see him coming, he's out of there. So like he's sprinting out of there. He'll beat the D line in any sort of like running situation there. So he's able to kind of just take off. And thankfully, our O-line has been really good this year, and they've been able to kind of give both Rourke and Jackson some time in the pocket before it kind of breaks down. But, yeah, I think overall it's just that 1-2 quarterback duo, I think we can be very happy with who we have at quarterback. And I think for next year, too, if we don't sign anyone for next year off the transfer portal, I think Taven, I don't know if he's going to perform up to Rourke standards. I don't think he will. But I think he'll do sufficient enough to keep us in that top 25. Maybe not 8-0, but I think he could be in that top 25 depending on who we keep and who we sign in the transfer portal next year.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I think it's also going to depend like on how we build the offense and like how Taven develops the rest of the year just to like see how he fits with the rest of the team, like who's going to stay and who's possibly going to come in. I mean, based on that, like I think that's going to affect how Cignetti is going to recruit people because he's going to recruit people. Like he recruits people based on experience. He recruits experienced players, and he also is going to recruit people that are going to work in the offensive scheme. So if you're like you want to make sure that you have the right pieces around your quarterback and that everything meshes together. And I mean, we've seen teams try to do this with the transfer portal. I mean, they definitely don't look at it the same as Cignetti does. I mean, Florida State, we know about DJU and how they paid him like $1.2 million to go over there because they thought that this guy was going to fit their scheme, and it just did not work. I don't even think he's starting anymore from what I've seen. I think they've just effectively moved on from him. But, I mean, with Cignetti was one of, if not Saban's best recruiters when he was at Alabama. So I think whether Taven starts next year or whether they bring in another quarterback, I think IU should be well and good with staying in the top 25. Whether it's 8-0, maybe 6-2 at this point next year, like we'll see. But I think we're still going to be a top 25 team for sure.
And I think there's been a lot of speculation too with next year whether Cignetti's going to stay and just where he could potentially go. Like I've heard a lot of people say he'll go to Florida. Like they're looking for a big switch. So that's been one big team that Cignetti has been rumored to go to next year. But yeah, no, like you said, like just with like that whole Alabama and like Cignetti recruiting stuff, like I just recently saw an article on ESPN about like the top 50 teams with the best 2025 recruits, and they actually just recently dropped out of the top 50. So I think it's going to kind of just be interesting if we're going to have to play like the transfer portal game again this year. Like obviously last year that was ridiculous with how many JMU players we got, including Signetti. But yeah, and you talk about also like the weapons around Jackson, how they were able to kind of like help him. There's a lot of like JMU connection in there. Like obviously Justice Ellison, he went to JMU, he got brought over. Elijah Surratt, he got brought over. Although Surratt didn't have a big game, he's kind of like one of the bigger leaders at that wide receiver position in that locker room area. So he's kind of there to help like mentor the younger guys. And then yeah, obviously Justice Ellison, he's just been phenomenal, and he's the RB1 for us for the rest of this year, obviously. But yeah, no, I'm hyped for this Indiana team next year. I don't think it's going to be the exact same as what we saw this year. It's not going to be like a record-breaking year at all whatsoever. But I think a top 25 team is it's written up there, and I think there's a big chance that depending on how well they play in the transfer portal, Indiana can kind of stay within that top 25. But only time will tell, and we're going to have to see.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be hard for India. I mean, next year it's going to be hard for us to break the records that we've been setting this year. Because I mean, we've broken a lot of our own records this year. I mean, but yeah, I kind of want to talk about the just to pivot a little bit, the Ohio State, because that Ohio State Nebraska game was something that I was kind of keeping my eye on a little bit, just because we dominated Nebraska last week. And for me, like, this was going to tell me how Ohio State really is in comparison to IU, because that's a similar conference opponent that we both play around the same time. Like, there wasn't going to be too much difference in quality of play, because besides the fact that we had a bye week against Nebraska and Ohio State didn't, but like we both played Nebraska 1 to 2 weeks after their bye week. I mean, Nebraska had a bye week against us too. So, I mean, it was pretty even for both. Nebraska also traveled on the road against us and against Ohio State. But Nebraska almost beat Ohio State in Columbus. I mean, 4-point game. Like, they had the last drive. Like, towards the end of the game, but then they got then there was an interception, and then that was it. But what do you think about just looking at the score? Like, Nebraska put up 10 more points against Ohio State than they did against us, and they also gave up less points to Ohio State than they did to us. When you first look at the score, what are you thinking about this?
If you take away the rankings, I'll say Indiana is the best team in the country. I think the score is very deceiving. Do I still think Ohio State's a better team than Indiana? Of course. But I think Indiana definitely outplayed Ohio State against Nebraska. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And I think, obviously, Nebraska coming into the IU game, there was top 10 defense, IU's going to get smacked around 56-7. I think that top 10 defense, even though they lost, kind of showed out against Ohio State. Obviously, Jeremiah Smith, who's just been a complete standout freshman wide receiver for OSU, he only had 3 catches. I mean, obviously it was for 70 yards and a touchdown, but only 3 catches. So he didn't really have that kind of explosive game that we would usually see out of him against other opponents. But honestly, that's going to be my X Factor matchup for this game, Jeremiah Smith against D'Angelo Pons. I think that's going to be the biggest matchup for just the entire game, because if Jeremiah Smith gets going, there's no stopping him after that. Obviously, he's had some ridiculous catches and ridiculous games throughout the year so far, and I think if he just gets going early, it's going to be hard for Signetti to try and figure out ways to stop him, just because of how good he is and just how versatile he is and just the way he moves and stuff. But no, yeah, I'll give Nebraska credit. Even though they lost, they played well, and they put up a fight against the 4th best team in the country. And obviously now Ohio State, they have a hard game coming up. This is probably one of the games of the year against a Penn State whiteout game. So, and I've said it all year too, because I don't like Penn State. I am not a believer in Penn State. I'm going to hate on Penn State. They are going to lose this game against Ohio State. I will place a money bet on this, actually. But I think Ohio State, like Will Howard, he didn't even play that bad. Like he went 13 for 16, 221, and 3 tutties. Like, and only 1 pick. But like Raiola, like when you look at the box score, because this is what I find very interesting. You have a 4-point win. Will Howard, I just said his stats. Raiola, he went 21 for 32, 152, 0 tutties, 1 pick. When you look at that by itself, you would think Ohio State wins by a wide margin. But when you look at the run game, that's very different because Dowdle, he had 14 for 60 and 1 tutty, while just the Ohio State running game, it was pretty much non-existent that entire game. But I think Nebraska's defense kind of changed the way they were doing things, especially because they had a bye week. So they came off of it looking at that Indiana game, trying to figure out ways they can just kind of shift things around and try and face that Ohio State team because obviously like Ohio State's better than IU is, but like I think the way the offense moves is kind of similar. But I think Nebraska, they really stepped up here, and obviously that's their 3rd loss. So the chance to get back into the top 25 at all, it's kind of pretty much out the door. But I think IU fans looking at this game should get a little more optimism going into it because keep in mind, Nebraska also went to Ohio State, so it's not like it was a home game either.
Yeah.
They played in front of the Ohio State fans, and they put up a fight. I think IU, they have a chance to kind of pull off an upset here and maybe sneak themselves into the Big Ten championship game against Oregon or Penn State, depending on who wins that game. But I'm not going to be any more biased towards Ohio State anymore. But yeah.
I mean, I think if anything, based on what you've said, I think this kind of speaks to Ohio State maybe having an offensive line problem. Possibly. I mean, because I guess with Ohio State with their receivers not really doing much of anything, I think that kind of speaks more to Nebraska being able to pass rush Ohio State a little bit more and being able to pressure, and giving Will Howard less time to throw the ball to his receivers. So Ohio State, I think, had to rely a little bit more on that run game, and I guess they just were not ready for that Nebraska team at all. Like, even though we pretty much gave them the key to destroy them, but they just, I guess they just weren't paying attention. But yeah, no, I think with these, I'm honestly, after that Nebraska game, I'm surprised Ohio State didn't move down 1 spot.
Really?
Yeah, just because they just did not look that great from what I saw.
Okay.
And Miami finally had they finally dominated an opponent for the first time after a month of having close game after close game after close game and just barely escaping teams. Granted, sure, it was against 1-win Florida State, but it's also an in-state rivalry game that has been going on for a very long time, where Florida State probably could have maybe snuck out a win because, in rivalry games, things get heated, and anything can happen in those games, whether it's a home, whether you're hosting it or whether it's away. Anything can happen in those games. So I'm kind of glad that Miami got to move up above Texas, considering the way Texas played against Vandy. But I really thought Ohio State would have moved down 1 spot. But kind of speaking to the Big Ten with the Penn State game looming, the Penn State Ohio State game looming this week. I think that's probably going to be the game of the week for sure.
1,000%.
I really don't think there's any other games that are going to be as nearly as interesting. Maybe Pitt SMU would be second, just because they're so close in ranking. ACC game, the ACC title game for them is on the line. But I think if it would be really interesting if Penn State beat Ohio State, and then a couple weeks later if IU beat Ohio State, because besides Ohio State, Penn State and IU have a pretty easy schedule the rest of the way through. I thought Wisconsin was going to give Penn State a little bit more problems, but they took care of things on the road. Unfortunately, they had Drew Aller go out with an injury. We'll see if he plays against Ohio State. But it really seemed like that Penn State offense was starting to find their rhythm with their backup. So I think just because of that, I think that could really shake things up for that Penn State Ohio State game and really make things interesting, especially in Happy Valley. Um, like, but just imagine like a 3-way tie for the Big Ten title game would just be absolutely nuts. Like, if that was to somehow happen, I mean, it's very, very unlikely. I mean, honestly, I think IU has a better chance of beating Ohio State than Penn State does, to be fair, especially like with Curtis Rourke coming back and everything. Like, I think we have a better shot than Penn State does, even though Penn State is hosting them in Happy Valley. But I mean, it would be really cool to see a 3-way tie to get into the Big Ten championship.
Yeah, and although I am not a believer in Penn State at all, I will give them plenty of credit. They played really well, actually. I think the score, like we said for the IU game, it's very deceiving. Like the 28-13 game, I think Wisconsin, I think they kept it close until the fourth quarter when Penn State put up, I think, 2 touchdowns. They put up 14. But yeah, I'm going to give credit to their backup quarterback. 11 for 13 for 98 yards and a tutty. Like, Pribula played outstanding. And obviously, when you have like really good weapons, like probably the best tight end in the country, Tyler Warren, and all these other people like Harrison Wallens III, and who's just been outstanding so far this year too. Like, I'm not going to say it's kind of hard to mess it up, but he was able to come into a tough situation in Madison where Camp Randall is just loud. Like the fans there go crazy. It can hold 76,000 people in there. Like, it was packed out against this Penn State team, and I think they lived up to that third team spot this week. And yeah, obviously give them credit. And I think them still being undefeated, I think they still do deserve to be above Ohio State just because of record wise. But I think after this week, I think you're going to start to see them switch over because I think Ohio State will pull it out against Penn State. And obviously Drew Aller, he'll come off of injury if he does play. So we're going to kind of have to see how he performs against Will Howard and that Ohio State defense. But yeah, overall, Penn State played they played really well against Wisconsin, and I'll give them plenty of credit for that. Just another game I kind of want to look over to since we've been talking about the Big Ten a lot. I was going to look at the Alabama-Mizzou game. Obviously, to be honest, I thought Alabama was just going to be ranked above IU just because of the shutout they had, and obviously there a lot of like speculation that Alabama bias is still kind of in the air a little bit, but obviously they're 14 and IU's 13, so IU's still kind of holding that spot above Alabama. But that game, I don't know. I thought that kind of blew me away just with the score. And you don't know this, but the starting quarterback for that game, Drew Pine, he went to my high school.
Oh, nice.
So that kind of sucked to see him not perform to the best of his ability, unfortunately. But yeah, Drew Pine, New Canaan High School, native, Connecticut. Yeah, we always root for him. But yeah, Alabama just completely blew them out of the water. And I'm just curious to see what your thoughts were about the game and just where they stand now against a ranked win against Mizzou.
I mean, from what I've seen from Mizzou this year, I feel like they have not really been they have not been close to the same team that they've been last year. I mean, they've had really close games against teams like Boston College and Vandy, where like at the beginning of the year, especially based on their preseason ranking, I think they were 9th in preseason. Like, you would have expected them to maybe dominate those teams, and then they go into this Alabama game. I mean, they just have not looked the same way that they did last year. They have not looked nearly as good. I mean, I'm kind of surprised at how many votes there is between IU and Bama after that game. I thought maybe Bama would have at least been within 100 votes of IU, but it's almost 250 votes separating them, which I think is kind of crazy. But I mean, at least in Bama's case, I think this is definitely a win that they needed to at least justify them being in the spot that they're in the AP poll, and maybe a way for them to turn their season around. Just because, I mean, ever since the Georgia game, I mean, they lost to Vandy. They had a close game with South Carolina. They've kind of been going down the toilet a little bit. But I think for Alabama and especially Kalen DeBoer, like new coach over there, like there's so much pressure for him to perform with this Alabama team. And and also I forgot about the loss to Tennessee, but like Alabama's just had a really rough few weeks. This might be the break that they need to possibly they're obviously going to have to win out the remainder of their schedule if they want any shot at getting into the SEC title game. But just because of how Missouri has looked this year, I'm not sure if based on the score, I'm not sure if it's because Bama is back or if it's because they beat up on a Missouri team that may be slightly overrated in a way. I mean, it's just hard to say just because of how, Alabama's been kind of really bipolar this year when it comes to performing. So it's just so hard to figure out whether or not they really belong in that 14 spot, even though they had a shutout win against Missouri.
And yeah, I agree with that completely. That's what my thinking was, kind of just like looking at that game and just like at the SEC just in general, like it's just so competitive. Like they have 8 ranked teams this week. Obviously, just Vandy they just dropped out because Mizzou just took that 25 spot after their loss and after Vandy's loss to Texas. But yeah, I completely agree. I don't think they're going to make the playoffs at all anymore just because of how competitive all the other conferences have been, like especially the Big Ten, which has just changed completely. But one team that I was looking at that I think has a chance to not just make the SEC championship, but to win the SEC championship, Texas A&M.
Yes.
I think they are the only unbeaten SEC team right now, and the only ranked match they have left in conference play is Texas at home at the last game of the season. I think based off of Texas's most recent performances against Vandy, especially that 3-point game that was kind of a little nerve-wracking, and we kind of saw Quinn Ewers not play up to his normal standard earlier in the season. A&M at home, they have a huge shot to host Texas, win there, and then play the next highest SEC team in the SEC championship game, and they can snag that 1 or 2 seed. I don't think it'll happen. I think they can make the game. I don't think they're going to win it just because of obviously Georgia. They've been doing great recently, obviously with that big win last weekend. Then you had Tennessee, which I don't know. There's a lot of inconsistency within the SEC right now, so you can't really like make a bold prediction. But obviously Texas is up there, Georgia's up there, Texas A&M. But yeah, I find Texas A&M very interesting, and I think looking back at the rankings, I said to myself that I think they should be a little higher. I think they should be. I mean, they moved up 4 after beating LSU by 15. I think they should be 8. I think they should replace where LSU was. I think they are a better team than BYU. I think they are a better team than Notre Dame. Do I think they deserve to be above Tennessee? Not yet. I think they should be solidly 8th right now. BYU and Notre Dame slide. And I don't know. They just looked incredible. And I'm actually very excited to see how this Texas A&M team does moving forward, because being now the sole SEC team that's undefeated in conference play, they kind of have some wiggle room now if they want to make a move, especially since their only game left is against Texas at home, which is a very hard atmosphere to play in.
Yeah, I mean, kind of going, at least with the rankings, I think the only reason why Texas A&M is below Notre Dame is just because of that head-to-head matchup. But I think Notre Dame, Texas A&M, and BYU should all be above Tennessee. I mean, I know Tennessee had the bye week and everything, but I mean, even in that win against Bama, they really did not look that impressive to me at all. And I think Tennessee could easily slip up at any point this year just because they're so reliant on their offense. And if their offense isn't firing, then it's all on their, I mean, obviously it's all on their defense, but like their defense is definitely not like, at least like talking about like talent on both sides of the ball. Like I think Tennessee's offense technically has more talent than their defensive sides of the ball. But I mean, Notre Dame's finally starting to actually like look decent. I mean, they looked a little bit shaky against Georgia Tech, and then this week they go up against Navy, and trounced them 51-14 in one of the Holy War games. And then BYU, they come out on top against UCF, which was people I think including us were saying that could be a trap game going into Central Florida, but they won 37-24. And then obviously Texas A&M beating LSU 38-23, like huge win at home. But I think just by the way that all three of those teams have looked, they could easily be above Tennessee in my mind. And I mean, they're all like pretty close in range. They're around up. They're like within 100 votes of each other for the most part. I mean, Texas A&M is just outside of 100 within those four teams. But I mean, they're all really close when it comes to votes in the AP. But yeah, no, I really think that I think Tennessee could slip up at some point, take maybe 2 or 3 losses going down the line if their offense doesn't get better. I mean, they're very lucky they had the bye week, so we'll see what happens with them after that bye week. I mean, they're going to be going up against Kentucky this weekend, which I think that's probably top game number 3 for me to watch, just because, I mean, that's a rivalry of its own in a way. And I mean, Kentucky has held Georgia, like they had a 1-point loss to Georgia. They beat Ole Miss. Like Kentucky's defense is even though Kentucky's not ranked, I think Kentucky has one of the best defenses in college football right now. I mean, their offense doesn't really do much, to be fair. But I mean, like Kentucky's defense, if they do enough to hold off Tennessee from getting to the end zone, I think Tennessee could lose this weekend to Kentucky if they come out of the bye week just not strong, if they're not firing right away.
And yeah, I don't know. I think Tennessee kind of has it in the bag, and I'll tell you why. I think the Auburn-Kentucky game, obviously the battle of 2 really crappy SEC teams this year, that was kind of there's not a lot to talk about it, but I'll say like it was kind of like a big morale booster for both these teams if you were to win this game. And obviously Kentucky earlier in the year, they had some spectacular games. Like obviously the Georgia loss, they only lost by 1 when Georgia was ranked 1 at the time. And then obviously they beat Ole Miss when they were ranked 6th by 3. Then I guess at the time they lost to Vandy by 7, who was ranked in the top 25 last week. I don't know. I just think that loss to Auburn and Florida just kind of like shook them up a little bit. And I think that's kind of going to kind of transfer over to when they play Tennessee, especially since it's at Tennessee. So they don't kind of have that home crowd behind them, like just like rooting for them a little bit. But yeah, I think Tennessee's kind of got that. But I was looking at like the top 25 when it first came out too, and I was looking at all the unbeaten teams. And I think 2 of them that I'm very shaky about is BYU and Iowa State. Obviously, BYU and Iowa State, they're the leading front runners for the Big 12 right now. And I think just recently, I think their play and just how dominant they've been have just kind of started to like take 2 notches down. Like obviously when you talk with undefeated teams like IU especially, like you see them like they just don't stop. Like they're just blowing people out constantly. Even with Taven Jackson, they won by 2 scores. With Iowa State, their most recent game against UCF, they won by 3. Then West Virginia, they won by 12. Like you can kind of see just it's sliding down more and more, and I kind of find that very interesting. And then when you look down the AP Top 25 a little bit more, you have Kansas State, and obviously they're 7-1. Their one loss is to BYU 38-9, which was in week 4. But I think Kansas State, they can pull out the Big 12. Obviously they only beat Kansas by 2, but I think just looking at their schedule looks a little easier compared to some of these other teams in the Big 12. Like obviously they have Iowa State at the very end of their schedule, which I think that'll be a very interesting game to see how that kind of plays out, because obviously that'll be a big implication as to which team will make the Big 12 championship game. And I think if BYU kind of wins out, then they're obviously going to have one of the spots, and then that game could be just like a determination of who plays BYU in that spot. But yeah, Avery Johnson, like he's been solid for Kansas State, and I'm kind of interested to see how this Big 12 kind of shakes out because now you're starting to get Colorado into the mix now, which
They're ranked now.
yeah, and
23.
I said it 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, that Colorado, they were kind of on the up and come up, and they've been that team to look out for in the Big 12. And despite all their like popularity because of Travis Hunter, Shadur Sanders, obviously prime time as the head coach, they've played phenomenal. Like they only lost to Kansas State by 3. They beat UCF more than the 3 teams ahead of them. They beat them by 27. Then they host Cincinnati at a night game in Colorado. They win by 11. They don't have any more ranked games for the rest of their season. They have Texas Tech, Utah, Kansas, Oklahoma State. Obviously, Oklahoma State was ranked and Utah was ranked, but they're only a 1-loss Big 12 team right now. So if there is a point where BYU or Iowa State kind of slip up, and I think Colorado can kind of push themselves up forward. Like obviously they have 2 losses overall, which kind of sucks because they lost to Nebraska in an out-of-conference game. Yeah. But don't count them out yet because I think there's obviously there's like 4 or 5 more games left for some of these teams, or if there's 4 games for teams to play. There's still a shot that Colorado can make themselves known in that Big 12 conference. And I think obviously when you have the NFL draft coming up, like you're going to start to see like Shadur go, you're going to see Travis Hunter go. So this is kind of like an all or nothing type year for them because obviously last year they went 3-9. They just like fumbled it completely after that 3-1 start. But yeah, Colorado, they've been playing really, really well. And I think the only top 4 team in the Big 12 that has no ranked games left. So I think Colorado, they can kind of creep themselves in. Obviously, they're ranked 23rd, and I think that's very deserving of them, especially after 3 teams in the 20s that were ranked last week are dropped out now. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how they kind of play out because I think the Big 12, I wouldn't say it's completely wide open. It's like narrowed down to 4 teams, but between those 4 teams, there's a lot of wiggle room for these like lower teams like Kansas State and Colorado to kind of move themselves up, while BYU and Iowa State, I've kind of noticed they've been sliding down a little bit in terms of like performance of play. They can kind of drop themselves and give these other 2 teams a chance to kind of make themselves known and possibly make the Big 12 championship game.
I think just kind of speaking to Colorado, I think the one thing that sucks for them is the fact that they're 2 losses overall. So they not only need like BYU and Iowa State to lose 1 game, they need them to lose 2 games. I mean, Kansas State, they need them to lose just 1 more game in order to like be technically tied with them overall. But I mean, that's a lot to ask for. I mean, Iowa State's and BYU schedules, they're not too bad like the rest of the way. I mean, Texas Tech, like Iowa State plays Texas Tech next to kind of, they lost to TCU in a heartbreak 1-point game. But that like Texas Tech was at one point in that conversation for the Big 12. They've kind of fallen out a little bit. And then Iowa State plays Kansas, Cincinnati, Utah, who's also like really fallen off. And then I think the one game that Iowa State might slip up in all of this is probably Kansas State right at the end of the year, Thanksgiving weekend. I think that is the one game Iowa State probably slips up in. And then for BYU, I mean, BYU goes up against, they only have 4 games because they have a bye week this weekend. But they also go up against Utah, who, again, like, I mean, they've definitely fallen off. They switched offensive coordinators, which didn't really seem to work. They also go up against Kansas. Arizona State, I think, could be a game where they maybe slip up a little bit just because Arizona State has been kind of Arizona State can get hot for no reason whatsoever. Like they just randomly will get hot at random points. I mean, especially they did beat Mississippi State, an SEC team. They were not expected to win that at all. So, I mean, Arizona State is definitely that Arizona State BYU game is something that I would have on watch for sure. And then, of course, Houston BYU at the end of the year. So I think when all is said and done, I think BYU and Iowa State probably take 1 loss by the end of the year. And then for Kansas State, they have a pretty similar schedule to BYU. I mean, they both play Houston, Arizona State, and Cincinnati the next few weeks. And then Kansas State obviously is going up against Iowa State, which I think if Kansas State doesn't get into the Big 12 championship even after beating Iowa State, I think if they beat Iowa State, that could be their way into the playoff without having to go through the Big 12 championship game.
Yeah, and I think the Big 12, like I think we talked about earlier, like the ACC and the Big 12 were the two conferences where we kind of had those like front runners. And obviously, I think the Big 12 is kind of more distinct. But yeah, you talk about it's weird because when I look at the ACC, when I look at the Big 12, earlier in the year, you had two teams that were kind of the front runners. You had BYU and you had Iowa State. Kansas State, after that one loss, they kind of slid themselves down. But and then in the ACC, you had Miami and Clemson. Now, later in the season, we're in the back half now. We're in that like last like 1/3. You have two more teams from each conference joining them. Like for the ACC, now you have SMU and Pitt, which they are making a tremendous jump. And I want to try to get into that Pitt and Syracuse game real quick after this because that was crazy to me. And
Just
then
demolished.
Yeah. And then for the Big 12, you have obviously Kansas State starting to make a push and then Colorado. So it's just kind of interesting to see how the ACC and Big 12 are just very similar in how their standings are kind of like shaping out because now you have four teams that are kind of making that push into the rankings. And obviously Colorado being ranked now, they're obviously making themselves known as a top 25 team now and after that big win against UCF. So obviously that was good for them. But yeah, it's just very interesting to see how that kind of shakes out. But yeah, I just want to quickly just mention Pitt because obviously they moved up one spot in the rankings over Ole Miss, who they beat Oklahoma in, which I find very interesting. But I think very deservingly, I think just ridiculous. Like Kyle McCord, like 5 interceptions, 0 touchdowns. Like Syracuse got destroyed. And obviously 3 pick sixes for Pitt and then 2 more just to add on top of it just for good measure, I guess, if you want to put it that way. But yeah, Pitt didn't have to do any offensive work at all if they didn't want to. Like they would have had 21 points right there, and Syracuse had 13 all game. So the fact that Pitt didn't have to do any offensive work and they still would have won, it kind of blows my mind. But Syracuse, like they were 5-1 going into this game, and obviously Pitt's ranked, they're undefeated. Pitt's a hard place to play in, but the fact that you're throwing 5 interceptions and 3 of them being pick sixes, it doesn't represent the Orange well, especially as a 5-1 team in the ACC where it's just, I don't know, like how are you like letting that happen? And obviously Syracuse, they had some votes to make the top 25 throughout the year. Like they've been scattered around. Obviously they never made the push into it, but they've just kind of been scattered around. Like they've been dished some points here and there, but
not anymore.
Not anymore. And I just found this game really interesting to me. And I think it's a really good sign for Pitt, though, especially because obviously, like you talked about stat padding and everything, but those stats is what got them to move up one rank over Ole Miss, who beat Oklahoma. And obviously, a lot of the top 25 teams who played this week, they all won. So there wasn't a lot of that movement that we would generally see when you have upsets happen. So I think Pitt played phenomenally, and I think they're completely in the running for that ACC championship in case either Clemson or Miami slip up.
Absolutely. I think Pitt is probably the most underrated team on this list right now. I mean, even just looking at the amount of votes that each team is getting between Pitt, Kansas State, and LSU, there's only 7 votes that separate them. There's 1 vote that separates Kansas State and Pitt, and then there's 7 votes that separates Pitt and LSU. And I think, honestly, I'm kind of surprised Pitt didn't move up anymore because, I mean, Syracuse is probably the 5th ranked team in the ACC. Like, they were a dark horse for the ACC championship, possibly. I mean, they only had 1 loss. And then they just go out and just display dominance at its finest. Like, I literally turned the game on, and it was like I turned it on late because I had forgotten that game was on. I turned it on, and I see the score was like 30-something to like 13. And I'm like, oh. And I watched probably 5 minutes of the game, and I was just like, this game's over. Like, I don't need to see any more. I'm like, Pitt's going to win. Like, Pitt was obviously going to win. I thought maybe Syracuse would launch some kind of comeback with Kyle McCord. But no, I mean, Pitt just shut them down instantly, and they did not take their hands off the throat. Like, they just choked them out in that game without letting go. Like, just from the very beginning of that game, they had them. And I'm kind of surprised that didn't get more respect. Like, I thought, like, last week, I thought Illinois was kind of getting not ranked where they were supposed to. I thought Illinois maybe could have moved up a spot, but then they got demolished by Oregon. But this Pitt team, I mean, I really think that they could easily sneak up on maybe Clemson or, I mean, even Miami. I mean, Miami, they're finally starting to find their dominance again. But I really think that Pitt could very well take Clemson's spot for that ACC championship game.
Yeah. And I think the ACC, like I said, like it's very similar to the Big 12, like how they have Pitt and SMU kind of moving up. But since we're like kind of running out of time too, especially, and we need to get into our playoff predictions, I want to give a quick shout out to my boys down at Washington State for getting themselves ranked. I think they've been deserving it for a while. Like they've had some votes, and now they're finally able to crack the top 25. I don't think they're going to get into the playoffs at all, but it's kind of nice to see them kind of make a top 25 appearance and just add themselves to a list of teams that we would not have thought would be in the top 25 this year. Like, I think you can add Colorado there. You can add Indiana. You can add Army, Navy. Like, there's
SMU.
SMU. Like, you can add so many names or so many teams to that list. Like, so, yeah, I just wanted to give Washington State some credit there because I think they are very deserving of it. We obviously talked about Colorado already and how they just moved up. So I figured that Washington State, since they're actually above Colorado and obviously one of the two sole Pac-12 teams, that we get them credits where it's due. And I'm happy that being 7-1, that they're starting to get more recognition and that they're in the top 25.
Yeah, I agree. I think Washington State being in that top 25 is definitely nice to see. I think they've been creeping around that, like, they've been like just under it for so long, like the past few weeks, and they finally like were able to get in. But yeah, no, there's been so much chaos, but like it's like good chaos where like more programs are starting to get recognized and they're starting to like get a chance to shine, and like it's now turning into where like one loss isn't necessarily going to determine like whether or not you miss out on the playoffs, especially since it's 12 teams now. But I think, like, I'm just going to go right into my prediction right now. My top four, I have them staying the same. Oregon at 1, Texas at 2, Miami 3, BYU 4. They haven't really given me any reason to knock them off just yet. 5 and 6, I still have Penn State and Ohio State. I moved Indiana up to 7, which might be a little crazy, but you know, I feel like they're undefeated. I feel like that, like I think there's only 6 undefeated teams left right now or something like that, because there was 8 last week and 2 of them lost. I feel like being undefeated does not get the same kind of respect as it used to. And just the way Indiana, like the way we have been dominating teams, I feel like that just gets so easily overlooked, especially with like the Ohio State, Nebraska, like comparing the way we played Nebraska and the way Ohio State played Nebraska. Like, I feel like it's so easy to just overlook that, but just because of similar in-conference opponents, like I feel like that should be taken more, like, with more emphasis, like just more of a point to put them up. I have Notre Dame at 8, Iowa State at 9. I mean, Iowa State, I mean, they had a bye week, so they had no reason for me to like punish them too bad. I moved Texas A&M in. I think last week I had LSU up there, but I mean, obviously Texas A&M beat them, so I got to put them in. And then at 11, I was going to have Clemson, but I took them out. I put in Pitt instead.
Wow.
That Syracuse game really impressed me. I think that was like that. It just spoke to me, and I was like, you know what? I think Pitt, they deserve some respect, so I'm going to put them in my rankings. And then Boise State, I'm leaving them at 12 because they played a really great game against UNLV. It looked a little scary for them at the beginning of that game, but I mean, they were It was on the road as well. I mean, they came through, beating a quality in-conference opponent. So I think Boise State at 12, like they get to stay there.
All right. So I got Oregon, Georgia, Miami, BYU. So 3 out of the 4 the same. I just got Georgia and Texas switched. Penn State, Ohio State, 5 and 6. I've got Texas at 7. I think I don't know. I think Texas can get their stuff together. And I think, obviously, my mind would have definitely been completely switched if they lost to Vandy. But Vandy, a ranked opponent in the SEC, they won. So I kind of have to give them their credit there. I got Clemson 8. I have Notre Dame 9, A&M 10, Indiana 11, Boise State 12. I think it's very different.
Oh, yeah, very different. Because, I mean, you have Georgia at your
I have
SEC
Georgia's my winner,
championship
and I only
spot.
have
Yeah.
one Big 12 team in.
I don't even have Georgia in my rankings.
Yeah.
So.
I think Georgia, I mean, I don't know. People still look at that loss that they had to Alabama and they're just kind of like, but I don't know. That win against Texas, 30-15, I don't know. I just think, obviously, they still have 2 more ranked games against Ole Miss and Tennessee, but I think for right now, I think they have the best win of the season so far against the ranked Texas team, who was number 1 at Texas. So I don't know. I think for right now, I think Georgia deserves to be up there at number 2, but we'll see what happens. But
It's so hard for me to put Georgia high just because, I mean, yes, they beat Texas, but Texas, it's ever since they played Georgia, they've looked so bad. So bad. And then, I mean, same thing with Alabama. Alabama, Alabama beat Georgia, but, they've also looked really bad. So, it makes that loss for me look way worse. And just the way Georgia's played some of the other opponents, it makes it so hard for me to put them in for the end of the year just because of how inconsistent they've been, especially on the offensive side of the ball. They've just been so inconsistent with their offense. It just makes it so hard for me to think that they're going to make it to the end of the year.
I don't know. I think out of all the conferences that we have, you have obviously the Big 12, ACC, Big 10, and then SEC. The one that is the most wide open by far is the SEC. I think, obviously, we've had the ACC and the Big 12. We've kind of had those now 4 front runners for each conference kind of show themselves. Obviously, the Big 10, a lot of it will kind of be determined based off of that 3-4 matchup between Ohio State, Penn State. So one of those teams will kind of slide out of that conversation. So at that point, you're really going to have Oregon, Indiana, who are both undefeated in conference and out of conference play, and then either Ohio State, Penn State. They're the 3 teams. And obviously, if Ohio State wins, that'll kind of be determined based off of when they play Indiana, assuming Indiana wins against Michigan State and Michigan before they play Ohio State. So obviously that's kind of crunched down to 3-4 teams right now. SEC, who knows anymore? That is wide open. And obviously now with the whole Big 12 the 12-team playoff now, that kind of leaves a lot more room for people to decide and look at which SEC teams are going to make it. Because obviously at the end, I think A&M, they have a huge shot of making the SEC championship game, which will kind of get them a bigger chance to get a bid into the playoffs. So that'll be interesting to see what happens there. And then just Georgia, Texas, Tennessee, LSU, Alabama. No one thought Alabama was going to miss the playoffs this year. No one. And I think just because of how competitive the SEC got, Alabama's not going to make it this year. And obviously we both didn't have them in our rankings for this week or last week, I don't think either. But there's just so much competition between all these SEC teams. And I think a lot of fans, especially for teams I'll give you examples like Tennessee, LSU, Mizzou, Ole Miss, Alabama, they're all going to be on the chopping block for whether they make the playoffs or not. And I think a lot of that is going to be determined based off of not just the conference play, but just because of how well other teams in other conferences do. And we've seen that so far in the Big 12, Big 10, Indiana, they've kind of exploded themselves. So they've kind of been one of those front runner teams that kind of take a spot away from one of these big powerhouse teams like the Alabama spot, which obviously they're now ranked ahead of them in just the top 25. So it's going to be interesting to see how it kind of plays out because a lot of SEC teams that we would generally see in that 4-team playoff, they kind of just run that. They completely ran it just like for the past few years. But now it's going to kind of start switching around to more of like the Big 10, Big 12, and ACC. So I'm very curious to see how that kind of plays out as the weeks go on.
And not only that, but I mean, very soon, I don't know when exactly, but we're getting close to the time of year where it's not only going to be the AP rankings that we're going to be watching, but it's also going to be the CFP rankings, college football playoff rankings, where and they broadcast those. But it's always interesting to see how different they are because, I mean, they rank teams based on different criteria. So for all we know, we might see Indiana at like number 6 or something like that, just because their undefeated record and like their offense and defensive rankings overall in college football. I mean, we could, especially this year, just because of how chaotic it's been, not just in the SEC, but like overall, we could very well see like just a flip around of like some of these rankings. And honestly, at the end of the year, I think it would be like if we make the playoffs, if we get like a 5, 6, or 7 spot and we get to host a playoff game, that would be electric. Like just the most electric it's ever been. I mean, and I don't think ever like that if you would have told me last year that we have a chance to host a playoff game in Bloomington, I would have laughed you out of the room. I would have been like, there is no way that is going to happen. But here we are. Like the chance exists. It does. It's crazy to say out loud, but it exists.
And I'll tell you, as like a freshman coming into IU, I'm like, this is like paradise. Like, who would have thought that we would be a preseason ranked basketball team for both men and women? Men's soccer's ranked, football's top 15 now. Like what the heck? Like, no one thought that. So, yeah. And I like just before like wrap it up, since we're like now like really out of time. I think an 11-1 Indiana team, they'll get into the playoffs not hosting a game. If they beat Ohio State, go 12-0, they will host a playoff game. They'll be like that 5, 6, or 7, like you said, because Ohio State, they're obviously top of the line, unless they beat Oregon, or if they go 12-0, they beat Oregon, then they get that 2 spot or maybe even 1 spot, depending on how the SEC shapes out. I think Indiana, there's still a lot of wiggle room for them, and I think the cards are in their hands now. And if they want to go 11-1 and go on the road to face another tough, high-ranked team, that's going to be on them. But if they go 12-0, beat Ohio State, host a playoff game, it's going to be crazy. So I think there's really 3 options for Indiana, and I think it's just, I don't know, they have 4 weeks to kind of make the name bigger and brighter for the committee to see. And obviously, like you talked about, we're going to start seeing those rankings now. So it'll be interesting to see how Indiana kind of shapes out now and how they perform against Michigan State, which I think should be a win. Michigan, which I think should be a win. Ohio State, toss up just because of the Nebraska game. If I saw that Ohio State like would have killed Nebraska like IU did, I would have said Ohio State easily. And then obviously Purdue, which should be an easy win at home. But we'll see what Indiana does. But I'm very interested, and they obviously have a big bye week. So after the Michigan game, so.
Yeah, no, I mean, at one point, I think the Michigan game, obviously we're hosting it. At the beginning of the year, I think that Michigan game was going to be a storm the field game where, like, we go storm the field. But, I mean, just because the way Michigan's looked this year, I think it's probably not anymore. But, yeah, no, I mean, even though, like, there's not really that many crazy matchups. I mean, we talked about 3 of them already, but there's not really that many crazy matchups. But it is also Halloween weekend. So something spooky might happen in one of these games.
I like that.
You never know. You never know. But we'll see what happens. I mean, we could see Indiana crack into the top 10, possibly, if
Hopefully.
some of these top teams lose. I mean, if we see Tennessee lose to Kentucky, I think we have a very good shot at making it into that top 10. But yeah, happy Halloween weekend. Whoever your team is, unless it's Purdue, because we don't like them at all.
Go Hoosiers, baby. Let's go. Come on.
But yeah, no, whoever your team is, unless it's Purdue, hopefully you survive Halloween weekend. And yeah. see y'all in November.